If someone had told me a year ago that my life, my meticulously ordered, predictably beige life, would be irrevocably altered by Julian Cole, I would have laughed. It would have been a dry, quiet laugh, the kind I reserve for absurd architectural proposals and clients who thought more glass was a personality trait. Julian was not a part of my life. He was a feature of the landscape, like the aggressive steel and glass skyscraper that blocked the afternoon sun from my office window. He was unavoidable, unpleasant, and cast a very long shadow. My world was built on 90-degree angles and quiet routines. I woke at 6:15. I drank my coffee black from the same white ceramic mug. I walked the same 12 blocks to the firm, my thoughts arranged as neatly as the blueprints on my desk. I found comfort in the predictable grid of my existence. It was a fortress, and I was its sole, content occupant. Solitude wasn't a punishment. It was a carefully curated state of peace. Then there was Julian. He was the antithesis of order. A senior project manager who moved through our open-plan office not like a person, but like a weather system. He was all loud phone calls, forceful gestures, and the faint, sharp scent of expensive cologne that lingered long after he'd passed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a kind of restless energy that made my quiet corner of the office feel small and fragile. From my desk, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of him, a curse I silently endured every day. I watched him lean over conference tables, his presence dominating the room, his voice a low rumble that cut through the office hum. He had dark, unruly hair that he was constantly pushing back from his forehead, and a jaw that always seemed to be clenched, as if he were perpetually bracing for a fight. He was, to my eye, a man built of sharp angles and raw confidence. Arrogant. That was the word I settled on. He saw my designs, my careful, nuanced work, as little more than impractical fantasies. "Leo," he'd say, his voice laced with a weary impatience as he stood over my desk. "This is beautiful, but it can't be built on time or on budget. It's a poem, not a building." Each critique felt less like a professional note and more like a personal judgment. A judgment on my quietness, my precision, my distance from the loud, messy world he so effortlessly commanded. The distance between us wasn't just the 30 feet of carpet and computer monitors. It was a chasm, a fundamental difference in the way we engaged with the world. He was action. I was observation. He was a hammer. I was a drafting pen. And so I kept to my routine, to my fortress of solitude, and I observed him, this disruptive force, with a mixture of resentment and a strange, unwelcome flicker of fascination. Then came the disruption. Not a small tremor, but a seismic event that shattered my routine into 1,000 pieces. It arrived in the form of a frantic, late-afternoon email from our biggest client. The Blackwood Mountain Lodge, a luxury resort I had spent 2 years designing, had a problem. A big one. A potential structural flaw had been discovered in one of the main support beams of the grand lobby. My design, my flaw, my stomach filled with ice. Our boss, Mr. Henderson, a man who valued his firm's reputation above all else, called an emergency meeting. He stood at the head of the conference table, his face grim. "This needs to be handled immediately." And quietly, his eyes scanned the room, and my heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Leo," he said, and my name sounded like a verdict. "You know the design better than anyone." I nodded, unable to speak. "And Julian," he continued, turning to the man standing by the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. "You know how to get things done. You know how to handle contractors and manage a crisis." A sinking feeling began to bloom in my chest. A cold, heavy dread. "The two of you will fly out tomorrow morning. The client has a cabin for you on site. Assess the damage, figure out a solution, and oversee the initial repairs. I want this fixed before it becomes a headline, force proximity." The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of my mind. Me and Julian, in a cabin, on a mount. It wasn't a business trip, it was a sentence. The flight was a study in tense silence. We sat side by side, a buffer of a few inches between us that felt as wide and as cold as the cloud layer outside my window. Julian stared straight ahead, his file open on his lap, though I never saw him turn a page. I pretended to be engrossed in the schematics on my tablet, but the lines and numbers swam before my eyes, meaningless. All I could feel was the heat radiating from his body, the sheer physical presence of him filling the cramped space. The cabin was small, smaller than I had imagined. One main room with a stone fireplace, a cramped kitchen, and two narrow beds against opposite walls. It smelled of pine and cold stone. Our luggage landed on the wooden floor with two distinct, final thuds. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing us in. The silence was deafening, amplified by the vast, empty wilderness outside. "I'll take this one," Julian said, his voice rough, as he tossed his jacket onto the bed farthest from the door. He didn't look at me. He was already unpacking, moving with a brusque efficiency that seemed designed to ignore my very existence. This was my new reality, trapped in a wooden box with the human embodiment of my professional anxiety. The first 2 days were a blur of cold efficiency. We were on site from dawn until dusk, crawling through scaffolding, examining the compromised beam, talking to worried engineers. Julian was in his element. He commanded, he delegated, he reassured. He was a force of nature, bending the chaos to his will. I, on the other hand, felt small and exposed. The flaw in the beam was my flaw, a public testament to my failure. I retreated further into myself, speaking only when necessary, offering technical data in a clipped, quiet voice. But in the evenings, back in the suffocating intimacy of the cabin, the dynamic began to fray. Away from the crisis, stripped of his professional armor, I started to see a different Julian. I saw him slump onto his bed, the confident posture gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. I saw him rub at his temples, his face etched with lines of stress I'd never noticed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the office. One night, I saw a long, faded scar that snaked up his forearm as he reached for a mug, a pale white line against his tan skin. I wondered where it came from, what story it told. It was a detail that didn't fit the invincible project manager persona. It was human. Another evening, he spent 10 minutes silently, methodically, fixing a dripping faucet in the small bathroom, his large hands surprisingly deft and gentle with the old hardware. He didn't have to. We could have ignored it. But the quiet, persistent drip seemed to offend his sense of order, an order I was beginning to realize ran deeper than just timelines and budgets. I found myself watching him, not with resentment anymore, but with a cautious, unnerving curiosity. I watched the way he held his coffee mug, wrapped in both hands as if to steal its warmth. I watched the way he stared into the fireplace, his expression unguarded, a flicker of something lonely in his eyes. The third night was the turning point. We were hunched over the small wooden table, blueprints spread out between us, illuminated by a single dim lamp. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and the low crackle of the fire. We had been working for hours, arguing quietly over load-bearing calculations and reinforcement options. "It has to be a steel plate brace," he insisted, his finger stabbing at the schematic. "It's the fastest, most secure option. It's too brutal." I counter, my voice quiet but firm. "It will ruin the aesthetic of the arch. A carbon fiber wrap would be just as strong and nearly invisible. Invisible doesn't matter right now, Leo. Fixed matters. It's my design," I said, a spark of defiance flaring in my chest. "The integrity of it matters." He looked at me then, really looked at me. His gaze was intense, and for a moment, I thought he was going to tear into me. Instead, he sighed, a long, weary sound, and dragged a hand through his hair. "Okay," he said, his voice softer. Show me. Show me how the wrap would work." The shift was subtle, but monumental. He was asking. He was listening. I leaned closer, my finger tracing the delicate curve of the arch on the blueprint. The fibers would be applied in layers, bonded with a high-tensile resin. I explained, my focus narrowing to the drawing, my voice finding its confidence. The stress would be distributed across the entire dash. I reached for a pencil to illustrate the force distribution. At the exact same moment, he reached for it too. Our hands collided. It wasn't a brush. It was a solid, undeniable connection. His fingers, warm and callous, cover mine. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot on my arm. The air in my lungs seized. My entire world contracted to that single point of contact. The texture of his skin, the surprising heat of him. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild, panicked bird in a cage. I snatched my hand back as if I'd touched a live wire. My breath hitched. I couldn't look at him. I stared at the blueprint, but the lines were a meaningless jumble. The silence stretched, taut and shimmering with a new, terrifying energy. When I finally dared to glance up, he was already looking at me. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes searching mine. He didn't apologize. He didn't make a joke. He just held my gaze for a beat too long, and then slowly, deliberately slid the pencil across the table to me. "Show me," he repeated, his voice a low murmur that seemed to vibrate in the charged air between us. From that moment on, something was different. The power dynamic, the invisible wall between us, had fractured. He started asking for my opinion, not just on the technical aspects, but on the project as a whole. He deferred to my knowledge of the structure's intricate design. "What do you think, Leo?" became a common refrain. I was no longer just the quiet architect who had made a mistake. I was the expert. I held the solution. And he, the great Julian Cole, needed me. It was a heady, disorienting feeling. The respect in his eyes was something I had never expected to see, and it did something strange to the fear I'd always felt around him. It began to curdle, to transform into something else, something warmer, something dangerous. On the fifth day, the blizzard hit. It came on suddenly, a thick, swirling curtain of white that erased the world outside our window. The wind howled, rattling the cabin's frame. We were trapped, truly trapped. Just after nightfall, the lights flickered twice, then died, plunging us into a profound darkness. The only light came from the fireplace, which Julian had thankfully kept well stocked. The flames cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small room feel both smaller and infinitely larger, like a cave against the storm. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't tense. It was heavy, intimate. The roar of the wind outside was a constant reminder of our isolation. There was nothing but the two of us and the fire. We sat on the worn rug before the hearth, a bottle of whiskey the client had left for us resting on the floor between us. We'd been drinking in silence for a while, the warmth of the liquor and the fire seeping into my bones, loosening the tight knot of anxiety in my chest. Julian stared into the flames, his profile sharp and thoughtful in the flickering light. He seemed miles away. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost missed it over the wind. "You know," he began, still not looking at me, "I've been a real bastard to you." I was so startled I almost dropped my glass. I said nothing. I just waited. "Back at the office," he clarified. "The way I talked about your designs." He took a slow sip of whiskey. I was jealous. The admission hung in the air, so raw and unexpected it felt like a physical thing. "Jealous?" I finally managed to ask, my voice a croak. He nodded, a short, sharp movement. "You can do something I can't," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "You can create something whole, something beautiful from nothing but lines on a page. I just manage the pieces. I'm a blunt instrument. A hammer, like you said." My breath caught. He had heard me mutter that to myself weeks ago. I didn't. "I mean, it's okay," he said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "It's true." He fell silent again, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks. I thought that was the end of it. The confession, the apology. But then he spoke again, his voice even lower, rough with an emotion I couldn't name. "That's not the only reason." He turned his head then, and his eyes found mine in the dim light. They were dark, intense, and filled with a startling vulnerability. "The real reason I was so agitated, so hard on you, is because I can't stop thinking about you, Leo." My world stopped. The wind, the fire, the blood in my veins. Everything froze. "I don't get it," he continued, the words coming out in a rush now, as if a dam had broken. "It's messing with my head. I've always dated women. But for the past 6 months, every time you walk into a room, it's like all the air gets sucked out. I can't focus. It makes me angry, and I don't know what to do with it." He looked away, back at the fire, his jaw tight with shame or confusion or both. I don't know what the hell is wrong with me. My heart was no longer a bird. It was a drum, pounding out a rhythm of pure, terrifying hope. My mind was a blank slate. Words failed me. There were no words for the tidal wave of emotion crashing through me. Years of hidden longing, of quiet observation, of hopeless fascination, all cresting in this one impossible moment. So I didn't speak. I acted. I moved, the motion feeling both dreamlike and preordained. I closed a small space between us on the rug. My hand, trembling slightly, rose and came to rest on his jaw. His skin was rough with stubble, warm from the fire. He turned his face toward my touch, his eyes wide and questioning in the firelight. He didn't pull away. He leaned into my hand just slightly. An invitation, a surrender. I leaned in, my gaze dropping to his lips. The kiss was nothing like I had ever imagined. It wasn't frantic or passionate. It was slow, hesitant. It was a question asked in the dark, a discovery of new territory. His lips were soft, tasting of whiskey and a deep, surprising warmth. For a moment, we just stayed there, a gentle pressing of mouths, a silent communication that went deeper than words. Then a soft sound escaped his throat, a sigh of release, and his hand came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. He deepened the kiss, and it was no longer a question. It was an answer, a raw, devastatingly honest answer. The morning was a shock of cold, white light. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine, silent snow. Sunlight streamed through the window, sharp and unforgiving. I woke up alone. My bed was cold. I sat up, my heart sinking. Julian was already dressed, standing by the door with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring out the window, his posture rigid, his shoulders tense. The intimacy of the night before had evaporated, replaced by an atmosphere so thick with awkwardness it was hard to breathe. "The snowplows cleared the road," he said, his voice flat, directed at the window pane. I called a car. "It'll be here in 20 minutes." My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. "Julian," I started, my own voice hoarse with sleep and confusion. "We need to get back." He cut me off, finally turning to look at me. His face was a mask. The vulnerability, the confusion, the warmth from the night before. It was all gone. In its place was the distant, efficient project manager. "I have to make some calls, coordinate with the team back in the city." He looked at me, but his eyes were guarded, remote. It was like a steel door had slammed shut between us. He left before I could find the words to ask what was happening. He just picked up his bag, muttered a clipped, "See you at the office," and walked out, closing the cabin door softly behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. I was left alone with the rumpled sheets, the lingering scent of his cologne, and the bitter taste of regret. It was a mistake, a moment of fire-lit, whiskey-fueled madness, a lapse in judgment brought on by a snowstorm. My carefully constructed world, which had felt so wonderfully, terrifyingly expanded last night, had just snapped back into place, smaller and colder than ever before. The spiral began. Doubt, fear, a wave of self-recrimination so powerful it left me breathless. I had misread everything. I had taken his confusion and twisted it into something I wanted it to be. I had made a fool of myself. Back at the office, it was worse. So much worse than before. Before, there was friction, professional tension. Now there was a void. He didn't just avoid my gaze. He acted as if I didn't exist. He walked past my desk without a glance. He sent project updates through other team members. In the one meeting we were both required to attend, he addressed his comments to the room at large, his eyes sliding over me as if I were a piece of furniture. The silence was a physical weight, a constant pressure in my chest. My fortress of solitude, once my sanctuary, was now a prison. The quiet I had cultivated for years no longer felt like peace. It felt like absence. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghost of his presence, the memory of his confession, the phantom warmth of his hand on my neck. Every quiet moment was a reminder of what I had briefly touched and immediately lost. I couldn't focus. The clean, precise lines of my blueprints blurred into meaningless squiggles. My carefully ordered thoughts were a chaotic mess of replays, of what-ifs, of should-have-saids. I had ruined the one fragile bridge that had started to form between us. Worse, I had probably destroyed my career at the firm. 3 days passed like this. 72 hours of agonizing, suffocating silence. I had resigned myself to it. This was the new status quo. A cold, professional distance that was 1,000 times more painful than the old antagonism. Then, on the third night, there was a knock on my apartment door. It was late after 10. My heart leaped into my throat. I never got unexpected visitors. I moved to the door like a sleepwalker, my mind racing through a list of unlikely possibilities. I looked through the peephole, and my breath caught. It was Julian. He stood in the sterile, fluorescent light of my hallway, looking wrecked. His hair was a mess, his shirt was rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't the confident project manager or the cold stranger from the office. He was the man from the cabin, the one who had stared into the fire and confessed his confusion. I opened the door. He just stood there for a moment, looking at me, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and desperation. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low and raw. I stepped aside, and he walked past me into my apartment. He stopped in the middle of my living room, my meticulously ordered, minimalist living room, and he looked completely out of place like a wild animal brought indoors. He turned to face me, and the words spilled out of him. "I'm sorry," he said. "Leo, I'm so sorry." I panicked. He dragged a hand over his face. That morning, I woke up and it was all so real. The sun was coming up, and we were. And I freaked out. He started pacing, a restless, caged energy radiating from him. Everything felt too fast, too big. I ran. I ran because I was scared. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. "I'm scared of what it means. I'm scared of what people at work will say. I'm scared of what my family will think." He took a deep breath, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. "But mostly, I'm scared of how much I wanted it to be real. How much I wanted you." He finally stood still, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "These last 3 days pretending it didn't happen. It's been hell. The most miserable 3 days of my life. The dam of my own fear and hurt finally broke. I thought I made a mistake. I confessed, my voice trembling. I thought I had misread everything, that I pushed you into something." "No," he said, stepping closer, his voice firm. "No, Leo, you didn't push anything. You just saw me. I think you're the first person who ever has." We stood there in the quiet of my apartment, the space between us charged with unspoken truths. We talked for hours. Or rather, he talked, and I listened. He talked about the persona he had built for himself, the strong, silent type, the decisive leader, the man who was always in control. He said his entire self-image was built on being that man, and that his feelings for me had taken a sledgehammer to the entire facade. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted, his voice laced with a raw, painful confusion. And I, in turn, admitted my own fears. I told him how I had watched him for years, how I had built a fortress around my own feelings, convinced they were a weakness, a dangerous liability. "I never thought you would ever see me at all," I said. We laid our fears bare on the floor between us. The terror of the unknown. The frightening, exhilarating possibility of starting something new. "I don't know what I'm doing, Leo," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of it all. "I have no map for this." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for an answer I didn't have. "But I know," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of certainty. "I know I was miserable pretending the other night didn't happen. And I don't want to be miserable anymore." He didn't leave that night. He fell asleep on my couch, fully clothed, utterly exhausted. I covered him with a blanket and watched him for a long time, the moonlight tracing the lines of his face, softening the harsh angles. He looked younger, more peaceful. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. It was a scent I was used to, but it was coming from my own kitchen, made by someone else. It was profoundly jarring. Julian stood at my counter, his back to me, his movements a little uncertain, a little clumsy in the unfamiliar space. He was wearing the same rumpled clothes from the night before. He turned when he heard me, and a hesitant smile touched his lips. "Morning," he said. The awkwardness was back, but it was different now. It wasn't the cold, sharp-edged awkwardness of rejection. It was the soft, fumbling awkwardness of a new beginning. We drank coffee in a comfortable, fragile silence. When it was time for him to leave for work, to go home and change, he hesitated at the door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. With a deliberate movement, he worked a single key off the ring. He held it out and placed it on the small table by my door. A simple brass key. "Just in case," he said, his gaze fixed on the key, not on me. "In case you want to be there when I get home." My heart did a slow, painful flip in my chest. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was a key to a door. It was an invitation into his space, into his life. It was a tangible act of commitment in the face of his own fear. And for now, it was more than enough. The months that followed were a process of careful navigation, learning the rhythms of another person, learning how to exist not as a solitary unit, but as a pair. There were moments of fumbling awkwardness, of misread signals, of retreating into old habits out of fear. But there was no more running. We talked. We learned to speak a new language, one built on honesty and a shared vulnerability that still felt terrifying and new. The office became a different landscape. The void between us was now filled with a secret, simmering energy. A shared glance across the conference room. A brief, almost imperceptible smile as we passed in the hallway. Our colleagues noticed a change, of course. The Iceman, as they sometimes called Julian, had thawed. He was calmer, more patient, and the tension between us had been replaced by a quiet, efficient collaboration that produced some of the best work of our careers. They didn't know why. And for now, that secret was ours, a private world we inhabited even in the middle of a crowded office. It's morning, not in my apartment, with its stark white walls and its rigid order. I'm standing in his kitchen. It's messy. There are magazines on the counter, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the table. It's a space that is unapologetically lived in. It smells like him, a mixture of coffee and that cologne I once resented and now find deeply comforting. I'm making the coffee this time, my movements easy and familiar in this space that has become a second home. The early morning light is filtering through the window, painting stripes across the wooden floor. I hear him before I see him, the soft footfalls on the floorboards. Strong arms wrap around my waist from behind. His body is warm and solid against my back. He rests his chin on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. We stand there for a long moment, not speaking, just watching the day begin. The silence between us is no longer a weapon or a void. It is a shared peace, a comfortable, breathing space where we don't need words. The anxiety, the constant hum of fear that was the background noise of my life for so long is gone. In its place is a quiet certainty, a feeling of being anchored. I think back to the man I was a year ago, the one who found safety in solitude and predictability, the one who built walls to keep the world out. Julian was never meant to be part of that world. He was a disruption, a storm that rolled in and threatened to demolish my carefully constructed life. But he didn't break me. He didn't destroy my fortress. He just walked through the gates I had forgotten to lock, found me in the quietest room, and showed me how to open a window. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, the unexpected variable that solved the equation of my own loneliness. He didn't just lead me to him. He led me back to a version of myself I didn't know existed. Someone braver, someone more open, someone who finally understands that the most beautiful structures aren't always built on perfect 90-degree angles. Sometimes they're built on the messy, unpredictable, terrifying, and wonderful chaos of letting someone else in.